The year is 1968. America is a nation on fire, racked by war, protest, and assassination. And in a gilded cage in Beverly Hills, its first and greatest king of rock and roll is slowly turning into a ghost. He is a memory in his own lifetime, a fading echo on the radio, replaced by the electric snarl of a new generation. Elvis Presley, the boy who had once shaken the world to its foundations with a swivel of his hips and a curl of his lip, was now a prisoner. His jailer was not made of steel bars, but of celluloid film and saccharine-sweet movie scripts. His warden was a carnival barker turned manager, known only as the Colonel, a man who saw his star not as an artist, but as an asset, a product to be sold, sanitized, and safely packaged. But in the suffocating quiet of that gilded cage, a flicker of the old fire remained. A television network, Singer sewing machines, and the Colonel cooked up a deal for a simple, safe Christmas special. A family-friendly hour of carols and cozy sweaters. It was meant to be another paycheck, another harmless piece of Presley product. They had no idea what they had just done. They hadn't just booked a television show. They had presented a king, lost in the wilderness, with a final, desperate chance to reclaim his throne. It was a gamble for his entire legacy, a secret rebellion fought in rehearsal halls and whispered conversations, culminating in one night of raw, leather-clad defiance that would burn his legend into eternity. This is the story of how the king, with everything to lose, bet it all on black. By 1967, the cultural landscape that Elvis had once dominated was alien territory. The British invasion had arrived not as a wave, but as a tsunami, washing away the slicked-back innocence of the 1950s. The Beatles were making art, the Rolling Stones were making noise, and Jimi Hendrix was setting his guitar, and the world, on fire. And Elvis? Elvis was making movies. Movies with titles like Double Trouble and Easy Come, Easy Goes. He was the singing race car driver, the singing scuba diver, the singing rodeo star. Each film was a slight variation on the last, a profitable but soul-crushing formula. Get the girl, punch the bad guy, sing 6 forgettable songs. The box office returns were dwindling, and with them, so was Elvis's spirit. He was living in a state of suspended animation. His days were spent on Hollywood soundstages, and his nights were spent inside his Beverly Hills mansion, surrounded by his loyal entourage, the Memphis Mafia. They were his friends, his protectors, his court jesters, but they were also his enablers, insulating him from a world that was rapidly passing him by. He was searching for something real. He devoured books on spiritualism and philosophy, seeking answers in ancient texts that he couldn't find in his movie scripts. He was a man with a deep spiritual hunger, being force-fed a diet of pure fluff. The disconnect was tearing him apart. He knew he was becoming a parody of himself. He would rage in private about the quality of the songs he was given, songs he called hogwash. Looming over this entire empire of mediocrity was Colonel Tom Parker. A master manipulator with a mysterious past, Parker had guided Elvis to unprecedented fame and fortune. But his vision was always rooted in the carnival grounds from which he came. Never give the audience the real thing for free. Always keep the star just out of reach, packaged and pristine. Parker believed rock and roll was a fad. He saw the movies as a stable, long-term investment. He saw live performances as risky, uncontrolled, and beneath the dignity of a Hollywood star. He had successfully isolated Elvis from his roots, from the very danger and energy that had made him a phenomenon in the first place. Elvis hadn't performed for a live audience in 7 long years. Then came the deal. In early 1968, the Colonel, ever the dealmaker, negotiated a package with NBC. For $1 million, Elvis would deliver 2 television specials and a feature film. The first special, sponsored by the Singer Sewing Machine Company, was slated for Christmas. The Colonel's vision was painfully clear. Elvis, in a tuxedo, surrounded by poinsettias, crooning "Silent Night." It was to be another safe, commercial move, another brick in the wall of his gilded prison. But the Colonel made a critical miscalculation. He agreed to hire a young, ambitious television producer named Bob Finkel, who in turn hired an even younger, more ambitious director, a man named Steve Binder. Binder was a child of rock and roll. He had directed the legendary concert film, The TAMI Show, which featured explosive performances from James Brown and the Rolling Stones. He knew what real, raw musical energy looked like. He wasn't interested in a sanitized Christmas card. He was interested in the man behind the myth. The first meeting between the director and the king was a moment shrouded in legend. It took place not in a sterile office, but in a small dressing room on a Hollywood soundstage. Binder walked in to find Elvis surrounded by his entourage. He wasn't the chiseled god from the movie posters. He was quieter, more reserved. But when Binder started talking, not about the show, but about music, about the blues, about rhythm, about soul, he saw a change. Binder told Elvis that his music wasn't what it used to be. He was honest. He asked him what Times wanted to do. It was a question Elvis hadn't been asked in years. The Memphis Mafia bristled at the director's audacity, but Elvis waved them off. For the first time in a long time, someone was speaking to Elvis Presley the artist, not Elvis Presley the commodity. A seed of rebellion was planted. Binder saw the caged tiger, pacing back and forth, desperate to be let out. He saw the smoldering embers of the musical revolutionary, who had been buried under a mountain of bad scripts and beach blankets. He left that meeting with a singular, dangerous mission: to bypass the colonel and resurrect the true Elvis. The battle for the soul of the king had begun. It was a silent coup, staged in the corridors and rehearsal rooms of NBC's Burbank studios. On one side was Colonel Parker, the immovable object, with his ironclad contract and his vision of a schmaltzy Christmas sing-along. On the other was Steve Binder, the irresistible force, armed only with a belief in the artist Elvis could still be. The Colonel's plan was a masterpiece of festive mediocrity. He had already commissioned a grand finale. Elvis was to sing Silent Night, and as he did, a giant, 50-foot-tall likeness of his face, made of glittering lights and holly, would appear behind him, a single, perfect tear rolling down its cheek. It was pure, unadulterated Las Vegas kitsch. Parker sent daily, insistent memos. He wanted a full orchestra. He wanted a cast of wholesome dancers. He wanted Elvis to read sentimental Christmas stories between songs. He was trying to produce the show from afar, molding it into another safe, predictable piece of Presley entertainment. He saw any deviation as a threat to the brand he had so carefully constructed. Meanwhile, Binder was waging his quiet war. He knew he couldn't confront the Colonel directly. Instead, he worked on Elvis. He moved the star out of his sterile dressing room and into a communal space with the writers and crew. He encouraged Elvis to just hang out, to pick up a guitar, to jam. He wanted to break down the wall of isolation that had surrounded the king for a decade, and slowly, it began to work. During breaks, Elvis would start telling stories. Stories about Sun Records, about the early days on the road, about the music that first inspired him. He'd grab a guitar and demonstrate a blues lick he'd learned from an old-timer in Memphis. The writers, Chris Bearday and Alan Bly, watched in amazement. This wasn't the wooden movie star. This was a living, breathing encyclopedia of American music. It was in these informal jam sessions that the true concept for the show was born. Binder watched Elvis, loose and alive, surrounded by his old friends and bandmates, and had an epiphany. This was the show. Not the orchestra, not the dancers, not the giant glowing head. Just Elvis, a guitar, and his music. Raw, unplugged, and dangerously real. He knew it was a massive risk. The unplugged format didn't exist yet. It was unheard of for a major star on a network special. He pitched the idea to Elvis as a way to recreate the feeling of those backstage jams, to make the audience feel like they were right there in the room with him. Elvis, hungry for authenticity, was intrigued. To make it happen, they needed to bring in the old guard. Binder arranged for Elvis's original guitarist, Scotty Moore, and drummer, DJ Fontana, to fly out to California. The reunion was electric. When these men, who hadn't played together in years, sat down in a circle, the old magic sparked back to life instantly. The sound they created was primal. It was the sound that had changed the world. Heartbreak Hotel, Jailhouse Rock, Blue Suede Shoes. The songs came roaring back, not as oldies, but as vital, living things. Elvis wasn't just singing them, he was inhabiting them. His body coiled like a spring, his voice a mix of velvet and sandpaper. He was rediscovering himself, note by thunderous note. But the Colonel was not a man to be kept in the dark for long. He got wind of the new unplugged direction and was apoplectic. This was not the deal. This was not the safe, family show he had sold to the network. This was rock and roll. This was dangerous. This was the very thing he had worked for a decade to suppress. He stormed down to the studio. Witnesses described a legendary confrontation. Parker, red-faced and furious, versus Binder, calm and resolute. The Colonel threatened to pull the plug, to sue the network, to ruin Binder's career. He screamed that this intimate, raw performance would destroy Elvis's image as a sophisticated Hollywood movie star. In that moment, Elvis faced the defining choice of his career. For 10 years, he had been the Colonel's loyal soldier. He had done the movies, sung the songs, and cashed the checks. To defy him now was to defy the architect of his entire career, the man who was both his protector and his captor. He listened to the Colonel's tirade. He listened to Binder's quiet defense of the new vision. Then, he looked at his old friends, Scotty and DJ, and at the guitar in his hands. He made his decision. He sided with the music. He sided with himself. He told the Colonel, in his own quiet way, that they were doing the show Binder's way. The rebellion was now out in the open. The gamble was officially on. With the battle won, a new energy surged through the production. This was no longer just a TV special. It was a mission statement. Every decision became a deliberate act of shedding the past. And nothing symbolized this transformation more than the costume. The Colonel had envisioned a crisp tuxedo. The show's costume designer, Bill Belew, had a different idea. An idea born from the raw, dangerous energy of the music itself. Black leather. It was a radical choice. The suit was skin-tight. A second skin that hid nothing and amplified every movement. It was the uniform of the biker, the greaser, the rebel. It was a direct callback to the untamed sensuality of the 1950s Elvis. A defiant rejection of the family-friendly movie star. When Elvis first put it on, he reportedly looked in the mirror and said, "It's a little different from the old Hanes." The air in NBC's Studio 4 on June 27, 1968, was thick with nervous electricity. This was the taping of the sit-down segment, the centerpiece of Binder's vision. A small, intimate audience was seated on bleachers surrounding a tiny, square stage. It was designed to feel less like a concert and more like a back-alley brawl. Backstage, the tension was immense. The Colonel was there, pacing like a caged bear, fuming at his loss of control. Network executives hovered nervously, terrified that this raw, unpredictable show would be a disaster. And Elvis was terrified. He hadn't faced a live audience in 7 years. The self-doubt, carefully cultivated during his Hollywood exile, came rushing back. He confided in Binder that he didn't know if he could do it. He was worried they wouldn't like him, that he had forgotten how to connect with a crowd. Binder, seeing the panic in his star's eyes, gave him a simple, powerful piece of advice. He told him to just go out there and do what he did in the rehearsal room, to talk to his friends, sing the songs he loved, and forget the cameras were even there. Elvis took a deep breath, walked out from the wings, and stepped into the light. For a moment, he looked almost shy, a king uncertain of his welcome. He sat down, picked up his guitar, and looked at Scotty and DJ. He mumbled a few words, a little joke. The audience leaned in, holding its breath. And then, he struck a chord. The sound that erupted was not the polished product of a Hollywood soundtrack. It was raw, visceral, and alive. He launched into Heartbreak Hotel, and the transformation was instantaneous. The doubt vanished, replaced by a coiled, feral energy. The voice, a deep, resonant growl, filled the small studio with an almost physical force. He was not just performing, he was testifying. He prowled the small stage, a panther in black leather. He joked with the audience, told self-deprecating stories about his terrible movies, and flirted shamelessly with the women in the front row. He was charismatic, funny, and breathtakingly sexy. The years of celluloid rust fell away, revealing the pristine rock and roll machine beneath. He ripped through his classics. That's All Right, Jailhouse Rock, Blue Suede Shoes. But these weren't nostalgia acts. He infused them with a new maturity, a new power. He was a man now, not a boy. And the music had a weight and a wisdom it hadn't possessed before. He was reclaiming his own history, rewriting it on his own terms, live, in front of the world. The sit-down show was a triumph of raw authenticity. But Binder and Elvis had one more card to play. One final, towering statement to make. They needed a finale. Not the Colonel's giant, crying Santa Claus Elvis head, but something with meaning. Something that spoke to the turbulent, violent soul of 1968. The show's musical director, Billy Goldenberg, and songwriter Earl Brown were devastated by the recent assassinations. They channeled their grief and hope into a new song, written specifically for Elvis. It was a soaring, gospel-infused anthem, a plea for a better world. Its title was a prayer, "If I Can Dream." When Elvis first heard it, he was moved to his core. This was the kind of song he had been searching for through all his years of spiritual reading. It had substance, it had soul, it had a message. He reportedly said, "I'm never going to sing another song I don't believe in." The Colonel, predictably, hated it. "That's not an Elvis song," he grumbled. But it was too late. Elvis had claimed it as his own. For the taping of the finale, the black leather was gone. Elvis stood alone on a massive stage, in front of his name spelled out in towering, blood-red letters. He was dressed in a simple, pure white suit. A stark contrast to the leather, he looked almost angelic, a figure of hope against a backdrop of fire. He took his stance, feet planted wide, like a street fighter bracing for a punch. The orchestra began, and then he opened his mouth. The voice that came out was not the playful growl of the sit-down show. It was a torrent of raw, unvarnished emotion. He wasn't just singing the words, he was bleeding them. As the song built to its thunderous climax, he contorted his body, dropping to one knee, his hand outstretched as if pleading with the heavens. It was a performance of staggering, almost frightening, intensity. He was channeling all his years of frustration, all his hopes for redemption, all his grief for a broken country, into this one, final cry from the heart. When the final note faded, there was a moment of stunned silence in the studio. Then, an eruption. The crew, the producers, even the jaded network executives were on their feet, their applause echoing through the vast, empty space. In the control room, Steve Binder knew he had captured lightning in a bottle. Elvis Presley, the man they had all written off, had just delivered the performance of his life. The gamble had paid off. The Singer Presents Elvis special aired on December 3, 1968. It was a cultural event. 42% of the American television viewing public tuned in. It was a ratings juggernaut, the highest-rated program of the week. But the numbers only tell part of the story. The reaction was seismic. Critics, who had spent years dismissing him as a Hollywood hack, were forced to reckon with the raw power they had just witnessed. They wrote in stunned, glowing prose about his magnetism, his voice, his startling vitality. A review in the New York Times declared, "He is back, and he is a phenomenon." The world had been officially put on notice. The special did more than just revive a career. It was a resurrection. It single-handedly killed the image of the beach blanket movie star and replaced it with something far more potent. A mature, complex, and still dangerous artist. The boy who had shocked the world in the 50s was gone. In his place stood a man, a survivor, a king who had fought his way back from exile to reclaim his crown. The reverberations were immediate. The special soundtrack album shot up the charts. He was offered a lucrative, groundbreaking deal to perform in Las Vegas, a return to the live stage that would define the final chapter of his life. The 1968 special was the pivot point, the moment that made the entire second act of his career possible. It was a staggering victory, a testament to the power of artistic conviction over commercial calculation. For one brief, shining moment, Elvis Presley broke free from his handlers, his formula, and his own self-doubt. He ignored the safe bet and wagered his entire legend on a single night of television, armed with nothing but a guitar, a leather suit, and the truth of his own music. He had won the battle for his soul. But as the bright lights of Las Vegas beckoned, the war was far from over. The Colonel was still there, the shadows were still long, and the pressures of being a king would prove to be a heavy burden. But for a little while, in the heat of the television lights, he was free. He was not a product. He was not a movie star. He was Elvis Presley. And he was electrifying. The legend of Elvis is a tapestry woven with threads of brilliant light and profound darkness, of triumphant rebellion and quiet surrender. The 1968 special was his brightest moment of defiance. But there are so many other stories buried in the shadows of Graceland. To uncover more of the untold moments and secret struggles that define the king of rock and roll, subscribe to Forever Elvis Stories. Join us as we continue to explore the man behind the legend.